All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. This is UC Center Sacramento. I'm Richard Kravitz, the director here, and it's really a pleasure to welcome both those of you who are here with us in person and also those of you joining by Zoom, and perhaps some others who may be listening to this ex post facto to this special session at UCCS in which we really are. It's the fruition of one of our two principal missions. The first of which is to provide experiential learning opportunities to undergraduate students throughout the University of California. But the other is to share knowledge that's produced on each of the 10 University of California campuses and 3 national laboratories with policymakers in the interest of supporting better public decision making. And this is often easier said than done. One thing that we're really excited about today is that the results that you'll hear about are a result of a collaboration that's been ongoing for now 6 years between distinguished faculty at multiple University of California campuses. It's just been an honor that UC Center Sacramento has been able to be involved, and we're really privileged to be able to host this event. I think you're going to hear about a lot of really exciting results with very important implications for elections and really for democracy as a whole. So without further ado, I'll introduce the leader of the program, Professor Thad Kauser from UC San Diego. Thad.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rich. Thank you to the UC Center Sacramento. And I really want to let you know how much I've appreciated this deep partnership, both under your leadership, Rich, also Cindy Simmons and Brooke Miller-Jacobs have throughout the life of this project provided this center as a home base for scholars from 5 UC campuses to work with state legislators, state legislative staff, and executive staff in the Secretary of State's office to collaborate to understand what are the research questions that the state needs answered with rigorous data-driven findings that we can provide at the University of California. Over the last several years, many states have moved to restrict access to the ballot, cutting down on the number of early voting days, making it harder to vote by mail, or imposing different types of signature requirements that can provide obstacles to voting. California, by contrast, has been at the forefront of a different model. Over the last several years, California has enacted major changes in voting rights laws and procedures that have been designed to expand access to the ballot and expand our electorate and make it more representative of this diverse state. What the New Electorate Project is, and you can visit our website, newelectorateproject.org, to learn about this collaboration, is it's funded by the UC Office of the President to bring together faculty from 5 campuses our first step was meeting with legislators on both sides of the aisle, with their staffs, with executive officials, to understand what the questions were about evaluating the impact of the changes that California made to how you vote, when you vote, and even what kind of text you get confirming that your ballot has been counted. To say, how did they change overall turnout, and for whom did they change turnout the most? Did this widen participation gaps along racial and ethnic lines, or along age lines that have so long plagued many democracies, or did they help to shrink those gaps? So we put together this research team, and there have been 10 scholars involved in it, and we have many of them here today who are going to present some of the research projects that they designed after consulting with policymakers, then carried them out independently through rigorous methods, including we've been running large-scale scientific surveys in every California election since 2018, and we continue to do so through the Yankelovich Center at UC San Diego that has been doing future surveys, including one that we're just about to release after the 2022 midterm election. We've collaborated with community groups, including California Common Cause, a nonpartisan group, to run large-scale voter mobilization survey experiments to see what are the messages that then turn out voters most, and especially turn out groups that have had lower shares of the electorate in past elections. And we've worked with the California voter file supplied by our data partner in this, Political Data Incorporated, to look at the impact of both these reforms and these messages on verified voter turnout to see really what the new electorate of California looks like. What we're going to do today is present in brief some of the findings of our recent studies, but you can find on our website both the 9 public policy reports that we've crafted for a broad audience, as well as information about the 10 peer-reviewed articles that we've published in major national and international journals that detail our findings. And if you reach out to us, we're always happy to connect with policymakers, with nonprofit groups, and with anyone in the civic sphere to talk about the research that we hope can inform the decision-making process. All right, so we're going to talk about reforms such as California's Voter Participation Rights Act that changed the timing of local elections, the California Voters' Choice Act that changed how and when you vote, and the Track My Ballot text service that has been used by the state and by registrars across the county, as well as some of the messaging work, the voter mobilization work. So we're going to go in this order with presentations, and I'm just going to briefly introduce everyone now. We'll each present, and then we'll take questions from both the audience and the online audience. And our presenters will be Jessica Traunstein, who is the department chair at the University of California, Merced, and a major expert on local politics. Cheryl Bedreau of UC Davis, who does work on messaging and uses experimental methods to find rigorous impacts on their effects. I'm from UC San Diego. My name is Thad Kauser. Mindy Romero of USC, who was at UC Davis when we started this project, but has been a vital part of it, even though she has moved away from the UC family, and she's the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. Gabe Lenz at UC Berkeley, who studies public opinion and how leaders and others influence elections. Seth Hill at UC San Diego, whose new book, remind me of the title, Seth? Frustrated Majorities looks at how elections work and don't work to convey the public will. And then also Jennifer Marola, who's the chair at UC Riverside, was kept on her campus by administrative duties. She won't be here, but we also have, to help us answer questions, Mackenzie Lockhart, who's just about to finish his PhD at UC San Diego, has been a vital part of many of our studies, including being the lead author on one of our studies published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So we'll all be around to answer your questions. And Jessica, please kick us off.
Great, thanks. So I am going to present one of the projects that I worked on with some co-authors. Jonathan Collins, who's at Brown, Eddie Lucero, and Ricardo Robles are both PhD students at UC Merced. And we collaborated on this project that's currently titled High Turnout Elections Change the Policy Priorities of the Electorate. So you may know that one of the recent reforms in California has been to move local elections to be concurrent with state and national elections. So I'm going to start us off today by talking not about statewide politics, but about local politics, which is what I study here in California and in the United States at large. So one of the questions that we wanted to ask and answer is, when cities move their elections to be concurrent with state and national elections, does it increase turnout? That was the goal of this reform. So we wanted to know, did it work? And for whom does it work? And if it does change turnout, then how does the electorate change as a whole? So this is the basic question that we asked, and you can see in this first graph, what we're showing is how turnout changed after the implementation of these concurrent elections. And you can see that we move along the graph where turnout is relatively stable until this one last bit of data at the very end of the graph there, which says that these are the once cities have changed to have concurrent elections, they do increase their turnout. So turnout increases across the board for every city that changes their election timing. But I want you to notice in this graph, there's a gap. And so what you can see here is that there, in the gray lines, what we're seeing are the cities that have elections that are concurrent with primary elections at the state or national level. And in the black lines, you can see cities that change their concurrency to coincide with general elections. There's a big gap here. And that is the point of the paper that we learned here. We didn't know this going in, but we learned that changing your election timing to be concurrent with primary elections doesn't do nearly as much as changing your election timing to be concurrent with general elections in November. So while we do see an increase in turnout across the board, the big jump comes from cities that now hold their local elections. These are elections for mayor, for city council, for any local office. Many cities are still holding their elections, their final elections for local offices to be concurrent with primary elections, which are not high turnout elections. But when they hold their elections for mayor and city council and other local offices in November of even years, we see a big jump in turnout. That's the first finding from this paper. The second finding from this paper is that when we see this big jump in turnout in November elections of even years, we do see a different electorate. That is what the bill intended to achieve, and it did for those cities that changed their timing to be concurrent with general elections. We do not see this same effect for cities that change their elections to be concurrent with primaries. But what you can see here is a big gap, a big change, and what you're seeing are different groups in the electorate. And the further away they move from that center line, the more their turnout increases or decreases when the election timing changes. And so what you can see here is that women become a greater share of the electorate in concurrent elections. Homeowners become a smaller share of the electorate in concurrent elections. And that means that renters, on the other hand, become a larger share of the electorate in November elections. And finally, older voters, and we've defined older very liberally here, I'm included, our older voters become a smaller share of the electorate. Now, this is, instinctually, it makes sense. Well, one of the things that we expected to find a more dramatic effect for, and found a slightly smaller effect, is that our white voters become a slightly smaller share of the electorate. But the change is not as dramatic as we expected going into this project. The final question that we ask is, okay, well, now that we see that there is a different shape to the electorate, who turns out to vote matters, and we asked, do their policy priorities also differ? Now, if you take what I showed you just a minute ago of the demographic change in the electorate, and you put it together with this slide, which is showing you the policy priorities of the electorate and how the policy priorities change when we see concurrent elections, you can see the effect here of homeowners being a smaller share, younger voters being a larger share. What you can see is that there is there's a powerful effect here on voters thinking affordable housing is a policy priority in concurrent elections. So what that means is that when local offices are elected in November, the voters who turn out to vote care more about creating affordable housing for everyone in their community. And that is less true when we have non-concurrent elections or even elections that are held concurrently with the primary. So to the extent that we are interested in changing the massive housing shortages that we have here in California, one of the policy levers is to change when we hold elections and to make those elections concurrent with November elections of even years. And that's it.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm Cheryl Boudreau from UC Davis, and I'm going to present joint work with Daniel Biggers at UC Riverside, Jennifer Morella, also at Riverside, and Mindy Romero, now at the University of Southern California. And so I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Jessica just mentioned in her presentation, because one of the things we're really interested in is the composition of the electorate and how different messages might change it. So instead of focusing on timing of election, as Jessica just talked about, we're going to focus on the different messages that get disseminated in elections by civic organizations, community groups, and so on and so forth, and examine what effect that has on the racial and ethnic composition of the electorate. So the motivation for this project was the well-known finding that California's electorate is not representative of the general population. So I have up here some data from the Public Policy Institute of California. This is data from 2018, 2019, but these patterns largely hold, which show that if you look at all adults, you can see that whites are, sort of about 42%, at least in 2018, 2019. But if you look among likely voters, you can see that whites are a majority, okay? And so whites are actually overrepresented in the electorate compared to their percentage in the population. Conversely, if you look among Latinos, which according to this data, they were about 35% of the population, but then you look here at likely voters in the electorate, and Latinos only make up about 19%, right? So on the one hand, you can look at all adults, and you see sort of one pattern emerge, but then when you start looking at likely voters, you see that whites are overrepresented relative to the population, whereas Latinos and other ethnic groups are underrepresented relative to their presence in the population. And so we were interested in seeing how the different kinds of messages that groups disseminate might affect and maybe spur some of these underrepresented groups to be more likely to turn out and vote and participate in politics. So in particular, our study wanted to address whether racial and ethnic minorities can be mobilized to participate at greater rates. In particular, we wondered whether messages about a group's underrepresentation in the electorate might be effective at increasing their political participation. So when people learn that their ethnic group or their racial group is underrepresented relative to their presence in the population, is that going to spur them to participate? Is that going to be motivating to make them to try to correct that imbalance? So to get at these questions, we conducted a field experiment looking at Asians, Blacks, and Latinx in California. We conducted this field experiment in conjunction with Common Cause. And in the study, what happened was basically we contacted, there were about 77,000 people included in the study, and some of them were assigned to get a message from Common Cause. So they received a letter, and we varied what was conveyed in that letter, okay? And what we did was we used a field experiment, as I mentioned, and so we randomly assigned people to get different messages, with the idea being that then we can compare one group in their behavior to other groups that got a different message. So in particular, we included two types of messages in our study. One was just a simple reminder about the election, just reminding people to vote. And again, this kind of came on letterhead from Common Cause. And I'll show you these messages in just a minute. In a second group, some people got this same reminder, but they also got information about the unrepresentativeness of the California electorate. And then finally, some people in the study just got no contact whatsoever. Okay, and we were interested in examining whether these different messages had an effect on voter turnout in the March 2020 primary election. Okay, so let me just show you the messages that we gave to people so you can see what was going on in the study. So in one group, people are getting a reminder about voting. Okay, so the message just reads something like, "Dear registered voter, you're currently a registered voter in the state of California." And then, right, the purpose of this letter is to remind you about the primary election that we held on March 3rd of 2020. Okay, went on to have some language about voting as a right, kind of reminding them the importance of exercising their right to vote and saying, hey, democracy functions best when we all participate. So this is a pretty standard kind of election reminder that community groups and others tend to disseminate. What changed in the second group of voters that we examined was they got the same letter, but they also got some information about underrepresentation in the California electorate. So the highlighted portions in yellow are the new language. Everything else is the same. But the only thing that changed was that people were told that many people are concerned about our state's underrepresented electorate. And they were given some data. So they were told that in a recent California election, eligible white voters were 17.5 percentage points more likely to vote than eligible non-white voters. Again, kind of trying to convey this sort of underrepresentation, and then in this last sentence, kind of connecting it to, hey, the diversity of the electorate matters for the kinds of policy priorities that people have. Again, kind of picking up on a theme that Jessica mentioned in her presentation. So what do we find? Do these messages make a difference for the composition of California's electorate? So we found that both messages increased turnout by about 1% relative to no contact. So both of these messages made people more likely to turn out compared to people that didn't get a letter from Common Cause. What was interesting and somewhat surprising to us is that there was really not a difference between just getting a reminder and getting a reminder plus some information about the underrepresentativeness of California's election. So it didn't seem like that information about the unrepresentative electorate really mattered above and beyond the reminder. And then we also found, I think, some interesting different effects for racial and ethnic groups. So actually neither message was effective among Asians or African Americans, which I think raises a question about how can we kind of mobilize these groups more. And both messages, really what was driving our results is that these messages were quite effective among Latinos and increasing turnout among that particular racial and ethnic group. So I think this raises some interesting further questions for our group to examine, but I will stop there and turn it over to the next speaker.
All right. Thanks so much. Maybe I've got mine first and then. Sorry. All right. Okay. Thanks so much, Cheryl. In beginning with its implementation in 2018, the Voters' Choice Act dramatically changed how Californians cast their ballots and when they cast their ballot. This was a system that mandated that registrars would send out a mail ballot to every registered voter in all counties but Los Angeles, that we moved from neighborhood polling places that typically had about 500 to 1,000 registered voters to larger voting centers where voters from any area in a county could cast their ballot, where there was more technology, more assistance for voters facing disabilities, and these centers were open from 3 to 10 days before elections. And so the question is, these were all designed. This followed a model of Colorado's way of doing elections, adapted to California. And the Voters' Choice Act, when the legislature adopted, was very much intending to increase turnout and also hoping that increase in turnout would be reflected among all groups in California. But many people worried that getting rid of neighborhood polling places, right, these neighbors' garages or a local school where you might be familiar with voting might lead to less familiarity and make it harder for people to turn out. So it was a real question to see whether the adoption of the Voters' Choice Act increased or decreased turnout, and for whom did it decrease or increase participation. Fortunately, the state rolled this out through counties that chose whether or not they could adopt it. And different counties, a set of 5 counties adopted it in the 2018 election, a set of 15 counties adopted it in 2020. And that allowed us to compare what was going on in these counties versus other counties that didn't adopt it in the same election under different systems. So I'm going to talk about an initial study of its 2018 adoption, and then Mindy Romero is going to talk about what she at the Center for Inclusive Democracy has found about its 2020 adoption. So we've got kind of Voters' Choice Act Season 1, Voters' Choice Act Season 2 coming up. This is joint work also with Eric McGee of the Public Policy Institute of California, Laura Daly and Mindy Romero of the Center for Inclusive Democracy, and myself at UC San Diego. The challenge for looking at the effect of the Voters' Choice Act is that you couldn't simply look at what was turnout in these 5 adopting counties in 2018 and compare it to the last primary in 2014. Because the 2014 primary was California's low point of voter participation, right? Fewer than a quarter of voters turned out in that election. 2018 was in the Donald Trump era, right? It was this very high turnout election in which voters across counties, no matter how they conducted elections, were highly mobilized. So what we wanted to do was not just compare those counties to their prior records in 2018, but to compare the difference in turnout that they experienced, the rise that they experienced in 2018, with the rise that non-adopting counties experienced in 2018. And so we also couldn't just make a comparison of adopting versus non-adopting counties in 2018 because the adopting counties were ones that had historically high levels of engagement. So rather than just looking at the difference between those two types of counties in 1 year or the difference within those adopting counties across years, we used what political scientists call a difference in difference approaches to see if the uptick in voter turnout was steeper in the VCA counties than the counties that did not adopt it. And the way we did this was by using data from California's voter file, looking at the individual level, that allowed us to conduct additional robustness analyses that made sure that these weren't being driven by demographic characteristics of the individuals, by the political characteristics of their counties, and to use programs that estimate from someone's last name and from their from the area where they live to estimate their race. To estimate their ethnicity. And so we're going to be able to report this for voters overall, and then report it breaking out Latino and Asian American voters who generally have distinct surnames. All right. What did we find? We found that in both the primary in 2018 and the general election in 2018, the increase in turnout in counties that adopted the Voters' Choice Act was stronger and steeper than the counties that did not adopt it. So looking at the general election, that increase, it was 18 percentage points in the counties adopting, 15 percentage points in the counties not adopting it, leading to an estimated 3 percentage point increase in turnout due to the adoption of this reform. In the primary, it was even steeper, about 3.5 percentage points. So the first verdict is the Voters' Choice Act, at least in its initial implementation in 2018, was something that increased turnout and California's reform had its positive effect. What did we find out about underrepresented communities? For young people, we found solid effects, estimated as somewhere between 2 and 7 percentage points. For those aged, I believe 18 to 24 was our definition of young, which is much better than the definition of old, being 45 plus. Must have been done by an author who's 44 still. For Latinos, we estimated a modest effect of about 2 to 3 percentage points increase in turnout, and for Asian Americans, we estimated little effect. So there were still some questions, but we found no community clearly fell further behind. So this looks like a reform that was that didn't close any of the participation gaps in California, but also did not widen them. And to learn more about it for season 2, Mindy Romero.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, 45 plus. I mean, geez. I mean, I'll be offended when I get there in about 20 years. Anyway, so yes, like the old Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the others. I'm from USC, but formerly UC Davis. I thank you for having me. What I wanted to cover today, looking over the kind of collection of research that I've been a part of, both with the New Electorate project explicitly, but also with my center and other collaborations. We thought, and I thought both, that we would present some research that you'll find on my website at USC Center for Inclusive Democracy, but that I've shared with all of my colleagues, and we thought was helpful to add to the conversation today. So just to let you know that we're kind of going back and forth between studies, but today I'm going to focus on this. So actually, when it comes to the Voters' Choice Act, The Center for Inclusive Democracy has actually put out a number of reports over the years looking at 2018, 2020. And for those of you that might want to take a deep dive into the impact of the Voters' Choice Act, but just also learn more about things like turnout and voting method and the voter experience in California, I welcome you to our website. Specifically for 2020, we conducted a number of reports, and I guess I can look right here, examining voting methods in the 2020 general election, vote by mail ballot rejection rates, reasons for rejections. I'll cover some of that briefly today. Voter information sources, voter preferences. We did a survey of county elections offices on their outreach efforts, as well as a representative statewide survey of eligible voters in California to better understand their experiences and how outreach may or may not be impacting them. And then also on our website, you'll find 6 reports that were commissioned from the Secretary of State's office, specifically on the Voters' Choice Act, that are the part of the collection of official reports required by SB 450, which is the law, which is the VCA bill, the Voters' Choice Act. So in the work that we've done, we examined by numerous groups, by race, ethnicity, age, gender, previous polling place voters. A big question in the VCA, moving to vote by mail, how would previous polling place voters adapt? One thing we haven't touched on, I don't think, is, of course, as counties were moving, some counties, 5 in 2018, 15 in 2020, and more since, they were adopting all elements of the Voters' Choice Act as required by the law. If you adopt all. But in 2020, we changed one element for all counties, which is all registered voters get automatically mailed a vote-by-mail ballot. So VCA counties have that. In addition to that, vote centers moving from polling places to vote centers, other services available, and so forth. Early voting up to 11 days. So we also have examined impacts on new voters, foreign-born voters, political party affiliation, voters with disabilities, and geographies broken out, VCA, non-VCA, but LA as a region statewide, and so forth. So just giving you some highlights because of the time today, but again, I wanted to let you know all that work's there on the website if you want to take a deep dive into any of it. So briefly on voting methods, I'm actually not going to talk about turnout, just voting methods today. I wanted to bring that into the conversation a bit more. So over the last 15, 20 years or so, California has steadily increased its use of vote by mail. 2012 was the first year that a majority of registered voters, of all voters actually casting a ballot, used vote by mail. By the time we get to 2020, 87% of all ballots cast were vote by mail ballots. Higher in the primary that we just had, we're still understanding the data from the general that just passed, but we expect to be very high numbers as well. But from 2018 to 2020, a jump in 20 percentage points. We had the pandemic, we had the change in the law where everyone was mailed a vote-by-mail ballot regardless of your county elections system. In person went from around 30, specifically in 2018, 32.9% down to 12.6%. But there are significant differences by race, age, geography, and so forth in terms of that percentage of in-person, which is important. So just looking at methods of voting by all voters, if we just want to look at the top bar here, those are the numbers I just mentioned. I said 12.6% of all ballots cast in 2020, general election, make sure I'm clear, or in person. And I said 87% were vote by mail. But in California, all the options that we provide voters, that does not mean they all went through the mail, right? So only 33% went through the mail. The most used method was Dropbox. And then 16% Dropbox or drop off at a staffed location. You can see that in VCA counties, that Dropbox number was even higher. The in-person, the blue, was even higher at 15.7%. A lot of that's driven by LA. If you take LA out and you look at VCA counties minus LA, you're at 11.7%. But again, significant differences by subgroup as well. So just because of time, I won't get into all those charts, but I'll note it here. So Latino voters, young voters, yes, age 18 to 24 as we define it. New voters, previous polling place voters, voted in person at higher rates in person at a machine, not with a vote-by-mail ballot, higher rates compared to the general population. Asian American voters cast ballots in person at lower rates compared to Latinos and youth. And these patterns, these follow what we've seen for at least the last decade and a half as my center and others have been examining these changing patterns. What's different is just everybody's increased in their vote-by-mail use, everyone's decreased in their in-person use. The relationship across groups is very, very similar But we still see these differences, right, where some groups are using in-person more than others, even if the majority of those groups are vote by mail. Now, because of the data limitations for black voters, identifying black voters in the data, which I can talk about in the Q&A, we were limited in what we could say about black voters in this voter file analysis study. But what we did do is look at majority black census tracts. And black voters living in majority black census tracts in California voted in person and via Dropbox at a voting location at higher rates than voters in all California census tracts. And black voters in black majority census tracts voted through the mail and Dropbox, as you can imagine, at lower rates than the general population in all census tracts combined. Rejection. Rejection, as we've gone up in vote by mail use, rejection rates have always been very low in California, although they do fluctuate. But the more vote by mail ballots, even with small percentages, mean you still have a significant number. In the 2020 general election, it was about almost 90,000 ballots that actually were rejected in California in that election. We've always seen disproportionate rejection rates by race, ethnicity, age, and that continued in 2020. It's a big question, would we see a tremendous jump in rejections because so many more people were using vote by mail? But we did see overall only 0.5% of all vote by mail ballots were rejected. But again, because of time, I won't show you these slides, but I want to emphasize that VBM rejection rates varied by county. They were higher among Latino, Asian American youth, previous polling place voters, and new voters. Okay? Quickly, just moving over to outreach and education. So if you didn't know, one of the requirements of the Voters' Choice Act, if a county is adopting, is that they're required to conduct outreach to community members, right? A certain level of outreach to make sure people are aware of it, to educate them around it, to also bring in partnership as much as possible, local community groups, right, to help do that work, to inform the implementation of the VCA and to get the word out about those new voting options. And those counties are also required to have a voting accessibility advisory committee, a VAC, and a LAC, Language Accessibility Advisory Committee. Okay, so I'm going to move over to that voter experience survey. I mentioned that one of our methods in the series of reports that we've put out, a large statewide sample, representative sample, English and Spanish, with oversamples of voters of color. And again, I'll move on because of time. What I want to emphasize here, there's a lot that we go through in the reports. But as we're talking about understanding changing voting methods and what that looks like in California, again, not just turnout, but methods that people are using. And there's been a lot of speculation coming out of the pandemic. Would those methods change? What does that look like? You have to understand that most voters, as we've identified in this survey and in a couple of other previous surveys that we've done, we've had consistency here now, the vast majority of voters in California cannot say that they have heard that there have been changes in how and where they could cast their ballot. We can't ask, do you know about the Voters' Choice Act, because people don't know a name to a reform, but we just asked broadly, do you know there's been changes? And as you can see here, for the total population, only 32%, right, coming out of that election could say that. Again, similar numbers going into that election for other surveys that we've done. Higher for black voters, lower for Asian Americans, a little lower for Latino, and so forth. And we looked at age, you'll see lower for young people, age 18 to 24. And just really quickly, we asked, why did you vote in person at a voting location in the general election? Again, a lot of material that we covered. But the highlights here for the total population, 28% voted sticker. You want that I voted sticker. 20% said voting to represent their community, or another almost 29% said I don't trust the mail to deliver my ballot. But you can see differences across race, ethnicity, right? So wanting that sticker much higher for Asian Americans, representing my community much higher for black voters. Trust in vote by mail ballot lower, but although that's a nuanced conversation, then we put a whole report out just specifically on the black voter experience, which I welcome you to take a look at, and so forth. Okay, so future elections. So we know the patterns in 2020. We know how people voted overwhelmingly, right, with that vote by mail ballot, dropping it off at a Dropbox or drop-off location. But we asked people, thinking ahead to future elections, what would be your most preferred way to cast a ballot? Of course, there can be very significant differences between how people prefer or want or think they're going to vote, between the reality of how they vote. But what we heard here is that people still are thinking about in-person, right? And you can see we broke it out. We said voting at an in-person voting location on election day, then 3 days before election day, 10 days, right? That's the Voters' Choice Act model if they have that or might have that in their county in the future. Mailing in, dropping off, and so forth. And you can see 22, 8%, and 33% said those numbers up there, right? So quite significant. And differences across races in the city that I won't talk about because of time. In the future, what features would you likely use if you used an in-person voting location? They said that 46% said they vote in person, but another 41% said to drop off their vote by mail ballot. And this is to emphasize that when we talk about how in-person voting locations are used in California, there's a lot of conversation and people just think about it as just going there to use the machine and that's it. But we know that there are lots of services, and under the Voters' Choice Act, required services, or accessible voting machines, language access, and so forth. People go there for those services. People sometimes go there to drop off their vote by mail ballot because they are more comfortable at a staffed location. And so in-person voting locations serve many needs and many purposes, and really kind of combining the in-person at a machine and dropping off at a staffed voting location are ways that we often encourage people to think about when you're looking at the numbers and looking at the stats. Okay, so in summary, in the 2020 general election, California voters overwhelmingly use those vote by mail ballots, but as I said, differences by race, ethnicity, age, new polling place, first-time voters, and so forth, and also differences by rejection rate, which I've already covered. Although counties employed various efforts, and we have a couple of reports just on this detailing the efforts on the county side in terms of engagement with the public. Many county offices reported that they didn't know which types of information were most effective. They did a lot, especially if they're working within the Voters' Choice Act system and had adopted that, but many said that they weren't actually sure of their reach, how they were reaching people. And I mentioned this here because I presented to you the one element of our survey talking about how few California voters know about the changes that are available to them. And on the flip side, election officials doing many good work, right? Many of them doing a lot of work to reach out, aren't fully aware or confident in the reach of that work. So just over 1/3 of voters, right, know about the changes, and findings suggest that election officials and community stakeholders, hopefully working together, implementing the VCA, shouldn't underestimate the degree of outreach that is absolutely needed and how entrenched that lack of full understanding. So people are using their options, but we're finding is people aren't fully aware of all their options. And if they were fully aware of all their options, maybe some of those patterns might be different, right? Especially by subgroup. And lastly, increasing investments in voter outreach and education. Those are our recommendations based on the data itself, right? Pretty straightforward here. Need to educate voters proactively, meet them where they are at, consider group differences, of course, and very much the importance of VCA coalition building early on, as early as possible, when counties are considering, because we have many counties that are considering for the next election cycle here in California, whether to adopt the Voters' Choice Act, and to understand the challenges at play in outreach for successful implementation. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. And as Gabe comes up, I'll just point out that your finding on lack of awareness really fits with, we had 4-hour-long lines at the vote center at UC San Diego. And I was talking to one student afterwards, it was on election day, he said, yeah, I walked by that center for like the week beforehand and didn't know that I could vote there. Right? Didn't know that it was available for early voting, but then got stuck in the line. So there's a lot more work to be done. All right, Gabe Lenz, UC Berkeley.
Thanks. And lack of information and awareness will show up in this presentation as well. It's a general theme. So I'm excited today to talk to you briefly about this paper, How Can We Increase Turnout Among Low Propensity Voters, with a number of our colleagues here, including Elizabeth Mitchell, who is now actually at Stanford. And this project was about trying to understand why people don't vote, particularly the least likely people to vote in the electorate, and what we can do about it. And to study this important topic, we ran a large survey of more than 11,000 Californians. We got such a large sample size, so we would get a significant chunk of voters who are, of Californians who don't participate that often in politics. And then we asked them a lot of questions, closed-ended and open-ended questions, to try and understand why they didn't want to vote. And we did that with an eye to messaging that we could use to target voters to try to increase their likelihood of voting. And two broad themes came out of this survey work in terms of why people don't vote. One was feelings of what we call external inefficacy. And that's a term political scientists use to generally mean a feeling that the political system does not sufficiently represent their interests to make it worthwhile for them to get involved in politics, and that there's no chance that they could change that broad system. And the second one was feelings of inadequacy, which I think are somewhat related. Feelings that people don't know enough, don't have enough information or awareness of what's going on in politics to participate in reasonable ways. And here's one chart that just shows you responses to a question that illustrates some of these tendencies. So this question asked people, how much do these listed items here keep people like you from voting? And people could answer not at all, a little, some, a lot. And you can see right up at the top there, for people who both did and didn't vote in the 2018 general election, you see people saying the major parties don't represent people like me. Individual voters never make a difference in the system, and so on. And we also asked people these open-ended questions, and having read through many of their responses and coded them up here into these broad categories, the categories that jumped out the most when we content analyze them were on the broad topics of voters or votes don't matter, they don't count. And in terms of that feelings of external inefficacy, the kinds of answers that people most often said were things like, well, the parties are just the same. So it doesn't make a difference if we vote for one versus the other because we just get the same result anyway. And that likely represents, to some extent, we think, a lack of awareness of what the parties are up to in the current American system. They also represented a feeling that the system is corrupt, that politicians just pay attention to organized interests, the wealthy, the elite, not people like them. There were also lots of responses that expressed concern about their votes not being counted, the system of voting just generally not working, not functioning along those lines. So we generated a few messages that tried to go after these targets, inefficacy and inadequacy. And then ran a large field experiment to try to test some of these. Some of the kinds of messages that we used were ones that just provided voters with basic information about the party's platforms. So we sent voters a letter that just said, very brief, simple statements taken from the party's platforms. Here's what Republican Party says it's up to. Here's what the Democratic Party says it's up to. When we read those relatively simple, straightforward statements, they seemed like the parties were up to very different agendas. So we hope that informing voters of that would both address these feelings that the parties are the same, it doesn't make a difference if they vote, and also address the concern that that they didn't know enough about the system to vote in a reasonable way. So that was one example. We developed a bunch of other messages that went after these targets. We sent voters letters expressing these messages, reminding them to vote. We found that these messages, unfortunately, had no effect at all, did not increase people's likelihood of turning out to vote, not among higher or lower propensity voters, much to our chagrin. But we think that these broad targets of inefficacy and feelings of inadequacy should be gone after by researchers in general and by these team of researchers in particular, and we continue to be interested in trying to pursue them. And I think maybe just to end on one broader point from this research and a lot of other research I've done, people are just constantly underestimating how little voters know about politics and what's going on in politics. And the more that we can build a society or system that makes it easier for voters to learn what they need to know to cast reasonable votes, the better off we are. And in the past, our governments have subsidized the provision of that information to a great extent, and we no longer do. And it's something to seriously consider for policymakers. Thanks very much.
All right, Seth Hill. Thank you. All right, I'm Seth Hill, and I'll close us off here. So, not just in California, but in the nation of the United States in total, there's been a dramatic change in the way voters cast their ballots. This graph on the right here is from the census for the nation overall, and it's the percentage of ballots cast in a non-traditional format, that is, not at the polling place on election day, so by mail or early. And you can see in 1996, only 10.5% of ballots were cast in a non-traditional format. In 2016, it's 40%. Obviously, in 2020, with so much voting by mail, it was almost 70%. But in 2022, we're going to be somewhere between 40 and 70%. This is a really big change, and it must have consequences. We've seen some evidence from my colleagues' presentations that people are uncertain about voting by mail. Even voters in California who get their mailed ballot, many don't want to actually put it in the post office. They want to take the time to go to a polling place and turn it in. So that's a low level of uncertainty about voting by mail, but we also know that there's stronger suspicions out there about the integrity of voting by mail and the security of voting by mail, and even about early voting or at polling places. So my colleagues and I, the same group as the paper that Gabe just proposed, wanted to see if addressing some of these concerns about security and integrity could increase participation. That is, are some voters not voting or not turning out in elections because they're concerned about integrity or security? So this was a study in the 2020 general election here in California. We partnered with Common Cause, and we sent almost 220,000 letters to registered voters in California. And these voters were of three different types. This graph here is an example of one of those three letters. We targeted their delivery 2 weeks prior to Election Day. And the letters said one of three things. So one was a very basic reminder letter saying, hey, there's an election coming up. Make sure to turn out and vote. And this was going to allow us to see, well, what's the effect of just sending any letter to voters? A second letter highlighted California's unique system of tracking your ballot. So part of the many reforms California has implemented is this program called Where's My Ballot, where you can register with the Secretary of State to get text message updates as you've mailed in your ballot. Has it been received? Has it been counted? And so one of our letters explained to voters about the Where's My Ballot procedure. Our idea was, hey, if voters are concerned about mailing their ballot through the post office, maybe this Where's My Ballot information and institution can help them feel confident in that voting. The third letter was election integrity. So trying to highlight the many different ways that the Secretary of State and California elections clerks make sure to have integrity and security in their elections. That's the letter here on your screen. I know it's a little small, but we had bullet points about specific procedures that election officials follow to make sure the election is secure. In the table on your right, we have the type of letter sent, the number of letters sent, and then the final column is turnout among the registrants who were sent that letter. Okay, so this was the 2020 general election. The discerning eye will notice that there is not a large difference in turnout across these three letter conditions. So those sent the reminder turned out at 75.47%. Those sent the Where's My Ballot letter turned out at 75.53%. Election integrity, 75.46%. And then if we just looked at the whole population of registrants who weren't sent any letters, they also turned out at 75.47%. So unfortunately, none of these letters increased turnout. And so the question is what to make of this? Well, I think the first thing to say is one election from us or from Common Cause
either about procedures or about the where's my ballot method, doesn't mobilize participation. And so why is that? There's a couple of different ways to think about this. One is this information is not relevant to voters. That is, we are wrong or someone is wrong that the voters don't know enough about the election to feel confident in the election, and that's why they're not voting. A second possibility is, as mentioned, we sent our letters in partnership with Common Cause. And there's some evidence out there that letters that come from official government sources are better received by voters, which makes sense. So perhaps had we sent it on Secretary of State letterhead or county election official letterhead, we would have had better success. Of course, we have to say 2020 was 2020. We had COVID. It was the largest turnout presidential election in history. It was prior to the unfortunate situation surrounding the presidential transition. So there's just a lot of things that might have been different about 2020. Another thing that I might note is while there's a lot of voters or survey respondents who will state their skepticism about voting by mail in surveys, we don't actually know that they're all necessarily reporting accurately. There's reasons that they might be exaggerating their skepticism about voting by mail. On the other hand, I do think there's lots of good evidence that there's uncertainty about voting by mail, and voting at polling place does seem to be preferred by a lot of voters. And so as the country and California continues to transition to more and more non-traditional voting, we need to think really carefully about how voters experience that, what their beliefs are about that, and think about what messages, particularly election officials, can use to help voters be comfortable through this transition. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.